Welcome to the Scholars Forum in the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. The forum consists of faculty talking about their recently published or soon to be published books related in one way or another with the Catholic intellectual tradition. It takes place on Teams, usually monthly, on Wednesday at 4 p.m. And the forum is sponsored by the University Core, the Catholic Studies Program, the Catholic Studies Center, and Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. It is an exciting expression of harvesting our treasures, and our faculty scholars are truly among those treasures. Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan said, "A university is a reproductive organ of cultural community. Its constitutive endowment lies not in buildings or equipment, civil status or revenues, but in the intellectual life of its professors. Its central function is the communication of intellectual development." And this is very clear in the case of our speaker today. We're very pleased to welcome our second presenter for the spring semester of 2023, Dr. Jeff Morrow, Professor of Undergraduate Theology in Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, who will be presenting on his recent book, Murmuring Against Moses, The Contentious History and Contested Future of Pentateuchal Studies, co-authored with John S. Bergsma and published by Emmaus Academic in 2023. Dr. Morrow, besides teaching in Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, also teaches regularly in the Core whenever we can get you. His expertise in biblical scholarship is a great gift to us. This particular topic of his latest book, Murmuring Against Moses, is very relevant to the Core, as Exodus is required reading in Core 1, Journey of Transformation. I want to mention that we'll have questions and answers after the talk. And that will be moderated by Maribel Andrao, Assistant Director of the Core. And to introduce Dr. Morrow, we turn now to Monsignor Jerry McCarron, our new Rector Dean, not interim, but Rector Dean of Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, and was just announced this week, so congratulations, Father Jerry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And yeah, and Professor Morrow has been the most productive of scholars, and he's on sabbatical this year. And when I approached him after the committee had thought it would be good to approach him, I wasn't sure whether he would say yes or no, because he's very, very disciplined about a sabbatical, and we completely respect that. And had he said, could we do this at some future date, I wouldn't have argued in the least, because he's done an enormous amount of scholarship, both in books and articles and book reviews. And he teaches a lot for us and for the Core, and teaches broadly. So even though he came primarily teaching biblical types of things in our undergraduate program, he's been extremely versatile in the graduate program, and has taken on, for example, teaching the Eucharist course after Father Chadwick became Vicar General and had to let go of it. And Jeff and his teaching is stellar, and his willingness to help, via committee work and in other ways, is remarkable. And so he's been a tremendous gift to the seminary. So we welcome you. I just want to hold up the book here, and we're very, very grateful. And for all of that, I will probably need to slip out a little early, because Cardinal Tobin is arriving probably about 20 to 5 or so for choral stations at the cross here. So I kind of need to be at the front door to greet him. But thank you.
Thank you, Monsignor McCarron. So we turn it over to Dr. Morrow.
Well, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. It's my pleasure to be here and talk about this book that John Bergsma and I worked on. It took many years. It feels like we were working on it forever. And at the end of the day, there was all sorts of last-minute revisions that we had to do. But it's wonderful that it's finally out. It's actually a pretty controversial topic. We try to be pretty careful where we go with this topic. So for those of you who are familiar with Old Testament or Hebrew Bible scholarship, you're probably familiar with the documentary hypothesis or some form of that, right? So the tradition within both Judaism and Christianity has understood those first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to be inspired by God and primarily the work of Moses as compiler of the traditions from before his time and as writer or author of the traditions from his time onward. And for really over 150 years, that has been challenged. As we show in the book, actually, it's been hundreds of years that has been challenged, and at some level, millennia. Actually, from the beginning, before the Roman Empire was Christianized, there were already challenges to that coming from mostly Porphyry, the Roman philosopher, and others as well. So we talk about that in the book. But for about 100 years plus, that has been replaced by the idea that the text is actually a composite of multiple different authors or authorial communities, centuries apart from each other, at the end stages of which would be about 1,000 years after the time period of Moses in the Exodus, depending on when you date that, right? So scholars will date that either to the 1400s BCE or to the 1200s BCE. And so we're talking about the final form of this text being closer to about 400 BCE, which is pretty much assumed in scholarship now, depending on what portions of the text you're talking about. And so what we do is we do three things. The book is really roughly, the 9 chapters are divided roughly into 3 parts. The first 3 chapters, the first part is devoted to looking at over 100 years of serious scholarship that's actually been challenging that from the get-go. So the most famous name in the documentary hypothesis is Julius Wellhausen, who many of you may have heard of before. Sometimes it's called the Wellhausen hypothesis or the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis. Really, he's at the end stage of a tradition that's in scholarship is going back over 100 years prior to himself. But he gives the most famous articulation of the documentary hypothesis. And his version then was published in English in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And from there, William Robertson Smith, who had been the editor for the Encyclopedia Britannica, he then published the English edition of Wellhausen's famous book, A Prolegomena to the History of Israel, and wrote, the foreword, basically, the end part of that is his essay in the Encyclopedia Britannica. So it spread like wildfire through the English-speaking world and the German-speaking world. And since that time, versions of this kind of are the starting point in Old Testament or Hebrew Bible scholarship. So we walk through about 100+ years of Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic serious scholarly critique on various elements. And they also disagree with each other. So these are arguments for, some of them argue for the antiquity of the Pentateuch. Others argue that it's very later than Wellhausen imagined, but they would argue for a unitary author. They all argue in various ways against this documentary hypothesis, which in some ways emerged in a bit of a vacuum. It was, even though Wellhausen could read many of the ancient languages, including Akkadian, that were being studied by scholars, he and these other scholars did this without really comparing much ancient Near Eastern literature. So that was it was mostly an internal literary theory that becomes important for biblical scholarship because debates about authorship and history based their views primarily on the documentary hypothesis. So later hypotheses about arguments about authorship of a literary form we call source criticism, basically base what's going on in biblical scholarship with the Pentateuch. So when you see this with the prophets, with Isaiah, or other texts within the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, they're basing their work on what came first with the Pentateuch, the work that was going on. So that's the first third. The second third, and we can talk more about that in the question and answer, but the second third is arguments that are often not considered, that did not emerge as much in this 100-year tradition that we spoke about, but are kind of newer arguments or arguments that have more weight, more new evidence for them that have not been considered before for the antiquity of the Pentateuch. We don't go very far. We're not going to the time of Moses. The biggest dating, I would say, the biggest controversial dating, there's 2 kind of real controversies in this. Was the Pentateuch primarily the work of one author, or however you want to call this, authorial community, or multiple? That's the first dividing point. And we don't do much with that. The second is antiquity. Is it mostly after the Babylonian exile? Right, so mostly after the 6th century, or is it mostly before? And so we argue strongly here that it's mostly before, that the bulk of the texts, especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which almost all of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, most scholars pretty much universally argue is after the exile. We argue that it's before, that Ezekiel, who most scholars will argue is from the time of the exile, is aware of the actual texts of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, what scholars will often call P and H, which would be the priestly code and the holiness code of Leviticus, and D, Deuteronomy, that Ezekiel is aware of those, especially Ezekiel chapter 20. Not simply traditions, but the literary text, that Ezekiel is aware of subtle things that are going on linguistically in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and pitting Leviticus and Deuteronomy against each other. These are the laws that he calls are not good laws. And John actually wrote an article in 2004 with Scott Hahn in the Journal of Biblical Literature, probably the most prestigious journal for biblical scholarship right now, arguing specifically that point, which has been a very important one. The other thing that we have in there, we talk about the Samaritan Pentateuch, right? So the Samaritan community is a northern community. They are the ancestors or the descendants of northern Israel. So I don't know how familiar my audience is with this, the JEDP hypothesis. It's more complicated than that. But J, right, the J texts are the earliest, I'm oversimplifying, but they're the earliest texts that support the southern Davidic kingdom after the split. After King Solomon, there's a split in the north and the south. And so the J texts would be the early ones, earliest parts of the Pentateuch under this scheme from the south, supporting the southern kingdom of Judah. And the E text would be a little bit later, supporting the north, that split from the south. And then P and D would be after the exile, also mostly southern. There's some nuance here in the scholarship. So the question becomes, a Samaritan Pentateuch, the Samaritans are descendants of the northerners. Knowing this history, you would kind of expect that if they are split, if the north split before Leviticus or Deuteronomy was ever written, you would expect that the Samaritan Pentateuch would be mostly E. They wouldn't want J because that supports the south that they're opposed to. They wouldn't really have any interest in P and D. And yet the Samaritan Pentateuch is basically identical to the Hebrew Pentateuch. The Samaritan Hebrew Pentateuch is basically identical to the Israelite one. There's some differences, right? So Mount Gerizim is the central sanctuary in Deuteronomy for the Samaritans, as opposed to Mount Ebal in the Jewish and Israelite Pentateuch. I would mention that both are near Shechem, so both are actually in the north, which makes you wonder, why would Deuteronomy be a southern text if its central sanctuary is in the north? And the third main point we focus on that's related to that is that there is no Zion theology. There's no Jerusalem theology evident in the Pentateuch. If portions of the Pentateuch are supposed to be late because they're supporting Jerusalem as the center of the monarchy, say during the time of Josiah, then why is there not a single reference to Jerusalem anywhere in the Pentateuch? The closest you have is Genesis 14, where you have a singular mention of Salem, where Melchizedek is from. He's a king of Salem. And we know later in the Hebrew Bible, Salem becomes Jerusalem. But there's no mention of that anywhere else in the Pentateuch. So the argument is this seems to be, at least the bulk of it, prior to the exile. The themes that come out later in the exile and afterwards are not present in the Pentateuch, Jerusalem being, or Zion theology being, one of the most important in the prophetic corpus. And then the final third of what we do is we trace the history of scholarship from the beginning. How did these theories develop over time, and what was driving them? That's basically a summary and overview of the book. And there's a lot in there, and if you're not familiar with any of this might sound fairly foreign. But why don't we open it up there for questions, and I could talk about any of these things in more detail if you're interested.
I might throw something just kind of entertaining that recently, in preparing a homily, I sometimes look at some reflections by the Jesuit scripture scholar Dennis Ham. And he had written a column for America back 30 years ago, and they put stuff into a book. But he just recounted, and I can't remember now the readings that it was related to, but he recounted hearing, he said, one of the maybe 500 odd Samaritans left in the world speaking at a Jewish cultural center. And he said that the Samaritan scholar started something like this, but it was, I imagined that he was smiling as he said it, but that wasn't clear for the text. He said something like, well, he said, we know that in the Pentateuch, there's no reference to any special place of the Temple Mount or Jerusalem. And we believe the special place to be Mount Gerizim. And we regard you, Jews, as the Southern heretics. So I imagine he said it with a smile, because I don't know that the talk would have continued long after that if he hadn't said it with a smile. But I was thinking of that as you were speaking, John.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to me. That's really funny to me. What's interesting about that is they don't place the Jewish and Israelite Pentateuch does not place the central sanctuary in a southern location. So even though it's not Mount Gerizim, it's right by there. It's Mount Ebal. It's in Shechem.
Yeah.
It's in the north. So it is interesting, but it is yeah. Please.
So I have a question as a non-Bible scholar, to which I do not know very much of this background, and I'm always happy to learn new things. And the whole idea of who wrote what when, it kind of reminds me about all the books about Thomas More writing about Richard III. But kind of what is the real significance of the periods within which different parts were written? Obviously of enormous interest just historically, but what would be the interest sort of in a Catholic faith type consequences, if any?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's less now than it was. And that's so if you actually look, so we have freedom to, the Catholic Church gives us freedom on these historical matters in the early part of the 20th century. So another time period I work on is the Catholic modernist controversy. So, and that really erupted, I think it has precursors. It was early, but it formally gets condemned in 1907 by Pope St. Pius X's papal encyclical Pascendi, where he condemns modernism as what he calls the synthesis of all heresies. And this is precisely one of the issues they're going at, is that Catholic biblical scholars were really running with these theories that were not traditional. And this is just one area. There's a lot of other areas as well. And so they thought it was kind of a threat. At the time, it was perceived as a bit of a threat. Well, if this doesn't come from Moses, is it even inspired by God? If it's not inspired by God, what role does it have beyond, say, Aesop's fables or whatever? And so that was kind of a perceived threat. So they had all these series of condemnations. And at that point, the Pontifical Biblical Commission wrote kind of authoritatively on these answers to these historical questions. And if you disagreed with it, I mean, you risked excommunication if you were a priest and a professor at the time. Those kind of juridical norms no longer really are in force. So we have freedom to kind of open up this kind of historical question. So whether this is from after the exile, before, it's not necessarily as significant, especially as we see this is inspired by God, for us. However, if we return to, say, the 17th century, when this really kind of rears, its head, the debates start to really get going in the 17th century, and then in the 18th century, everybody who's kind of asking these questions, so the big figures are going to be like Thomas Hobbes. These are also people I work on in the 17th century. So Thomas Hobbes, the famous English political theorist, Baruch Spinoza, right, the famous Jewish philosopher, and then two less famous figures, Richard Simon, who's a priest in France at the same time period, and a more obscure Calvinist convert to Catholicism, Isaac Laperere, who's more important for the kind of early studies of anthropology and geography studies. These figures wrote on this, and they wrote with a passion. And so you started to emerge a train of skepticism on the Bible and in philosophy, and then apologetics, defenders of the faith. And both sides saw the same thing at stake, and that had to do with the Ten Commandments. And so later, like Voltaire writes about this. Voltaire says, who really cares about whether or not Moses wrote the Pentateuch or not, except if he didn't, we can cast into doubt God revealing the 10 Commandments to Israel and Moses on Mount Sinai. And that does away with a lot of things like the prohibitions of adultery, idolatry, etc. And so the skeptics of the 17th and 18th century and those defending these traditional views in the 17th and 18th century saw this as really important for kind of moral norms. And so the argument was on the defender's side, it was if this is tradition comes from Moses, well, he was there on Mount Sinai when God revealed the 10 Commandments, and he's recording that inspired by the Holy Spirit. And if it didn't, right, everything is up for grabs, moral chaos. We don't have to think that that's true, but that's how they saw this. And the skeptics saw it in the same way. And so those who were actually arguing for more kind of moral chaos, that's one of the things they were using as a weapon in their defense. I don't think now, I think kind of this is kind of irrelevant in a sense now that that's not necessarily, how that has to be read. But historically, that's how it gets going. Initially, you have the skeptics using these historical questions to kind of advance a more skeptical agenda, say in the case of Spinoza or Voltaire. And that's not the case now. Pretty much everybody, uses those debates, and I think they do so more out of intellectual inertia. It's the reigning paradigm. So let me just give you one more quick comment on that. And that is, it's a difference between looking at the text as a whole work of a community, just at the human level, versus multiple theologies that are contradictory, that are basically trying to put forward a different political vision. So the J text, so let me just give you one clear example, Genesis 1-3. What we have in Genesis 1-3 is the creation of the world and the creation of humanity. So the traditional scholarly view is, for the last 100+ years, is that Genesis 1 emerges late. It's one of the last parts of the Pentateuch to be written. And so Genesis 1 is an anti-polytheistic text written after the Babylonian exile. Genesis 2 and 3 is a much earlier view, right? From maybe as early as King David, maybe as, maybe a couple hundred years later. And what's going on there? God walks in the garden like a human, right? And so it's a different view of God. It's an anthropomorphic God. And so what you have are two theologies in conflict. You have a later, the first one, a later, more spiritual God creating reality, and a second kind of more polytheistic, kind of Greek mythological God. And these are two warring kind of theologies in tension. And then what we have to do as moderns is figure out, does this tell us anything about God? Or is it just telling us something about ancient Israel's view of God, ancient Israel before the exile and ancient Israel after the exile? And then, of course, the $24 question is then, why did Israel hold all this together? And does it mean anything theologically, or is it just kind of a mythological text that we can do something with? And I think those are kind of more important questions. They don't have to be read that way, but that is how they're taught. At least that's how I was taught them when I was in graduate school by well-intentioned Catholic Bible scholars.
Oh, that's a wonderful can of worms, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot there.
Sorry for the irrelevant.
Not at all. No, I appreciate it. Not at all. I mean, I remember. So I was taught. I won't name names, but I was taught Bible by a nun in good standing with her order, a priest in good standing with his order, and an ex-priest who was a faithful layman. And all. Well, the first two, they basically. Well, one, it's not fair to the one, but for the priest and the both, well, the priest said, and I quote, "The Bible and theology have nothing to do with each other." And the nun described the Bible as an onion that you peel away the layers and at the end there's nothing there. And I'm a convert to Catholicism myself, coming from a Jewish background, and I just thought this is Catholic biblical scholarship. This is Catholic theology. And as I got more into Catholic theology and biblical scholarship in my doctoral program and studies since, those views aren't that odd in the world of Catholic biblical scholarship. They're not that odd. But it doesn't make the Bible the wellspring that the Catholic Church teaches that it's supposed to be, of theology and of the faith and of that sort of thing. So I think that the text tends to be a little bit more complicated. If it's all just made up by these different communities, I don't have to work very hard to figure out what it says. because any answer can do, and that's, I think, what a lot of Catholic biblical scholarship does. And I think if we want to take it more seriously, we have to actually spend more time with the text. That's what I would say. Again, because you're out of Catholic biblical scholarship, you might not realize this is really like I'm the heretic. Like if I go to Catholic biblical scholarly views, like this is like I could like lose my credentials type of a thing. This is really, this is kind of controversial, but
it's obviously fun.
I enjoy it.
I can tell. Okay, I'd be quiet now.
No, I appreciate it. Nancy.
And he teaches well. He teaches well, and I minor in Dr. Morrow. Nancy, go ahead, Dr.
Yeah, I
Enright.
know, I've heard so much about how wonderful Dr. Morrow is from this lady right here, who just absolutely loved your classes. But I think that's really interesting what you're saying about Catholic theology. And you're certainly no fundamentalist, but it's like that you're talking about traditional biblical scholarship. And I guess one of the things that struck me when you were talking about that is, and I don't know if this is even going to be interesting to most of the folks on this call, but from an English point of view, something developed in literary criticism in like the 60s and 70s in France, spread to America, called deconstruction. And what you're talking about in biblical scholarship, so to me, relates to the way deconstruction impacted the field of literary criticism in English. It's kind of like they often use words like subverting the text and question, like the onion analogy. That is there a text in this room that was actually a book in English. So I just, I think that this is something that was pervasive in scholarship, maybe in different fields, sort of permeating the way texts were looked at. But that was just sort of a comment. But maybe if you could just speak to, why you think it's important that the texts are older, that it seems like that's a big part of the book, and you're sort of giving credence to like the traditional, not that you're saying it's necessarily Moses, but that it's from an earlier time, more closely linked to that. If you could just speak a little bit to that, why that's important.
Certainly. Well, I actually do think that I'm no Egyptologist, and so I don't know. I cannot read ancient Egyptian, so that's a disclaimer. But if you look at the work that's coming out of Kenneth Kitchen, who is an Egyptologist from Liverpool and does read Egyptian and directs dissertations on that, and James Hoffmeyer, he's got two really important books, both published by Oxford University Press. The one is called Israel in Egypt: The Evidence for the Authenticity of the Exodus Tradition, and that was published in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. And then in 2005, Hoffmeyer published Ancient Israel and the Sinai: The Evidence for the Authenticity of the Wilderness Traditions. He's a serious Egyptologist from the University of Toronto, studied under Donald Redford. Donald Redford is not what you call like a pro-biblical, anything but a fundamentalist. People sometimes dismiss Kitchen and Hoffmeyer's fundamentalists, but Donald Redford, you could not do that too. And of course, he puts these things much later. And so I actually do think that the evidence seems to indicate these are from the mid-second millennium, that these are actually from the time period of Moses. Josh Berman, the wonderful Jewish scholar, published a few years ago a piece on the Hittite treaties and how Deuteronomy 13 fits that better than any of the later Assyrian treaties that put forward as parallels. Even the historical prologue that you see in these covenant formulas, which you have in Deuteronomy, and throughout second millennium BCE, Hittite trees especially, or Egyptians and others, you don't have that at all in the first millennium. We have no evidence of that, but we have lots of it in the second, in the mid-second, and the late second millennium. So I do think that seems to make a lot of sense of the text. In Kenneth Kitchen's 2003 volume on the reliability of the Old Testament, he's got this great line where he says, the text that we have, at least in Exodus and Numbers, at least there, seems to display such a firsthand knowledge of nomadic Semitic Hebrew-like tribes, like which you find depicted as the Hebrew people from the mid-second millennium, and yet really extensive knowledge of ancient Egyptian from the New Kingdom time period, so 1500 to 1100 BCE, politics, economy, treaty type behavior texts that you almost would need to invent a Moses figure who was raised in the Egyptian court, but knows his Hebrew traditions as well to account for what we actually have in the text. Happily, we actually have a figure like that presented for us there. So, so I think actually I think you can push this back earlier than we do push it. What's important about that? Well, if you believe this is inspired by God, it's not necessarily all that important. It's inspired by God would be some divine miracle that trumps any kind of historical questions. But just from a purely historical perspective, it makes it much more likely, I think, that they're preserving authentic historical traditions, right? That the cultures there that we're getting a window into something that's authentic. And I think that the more we learn about these time periods, the more we learn that the little details fit. We can talk about the big things, but when I talk my classes about the history here, I talk about the boring things about prices of slaves, because inflation worked then as it does now. And I talk about the types of names that are being used. And actually, especially in Genesis, a more interesting question, and I think one that takes the history more seriously, is not how much post-Mosaic is this, it's how much pre-Mosaic are these traditions, because the sorts of names that they are coming up with would be increasingly difficult to invent the later and more far removed you are from the time period than they are. Like, so I just give you one example, is this thing called Amorite imperfectives. So names like Isaac, Ishmael, they're names that in English we translate usually with an I or a J, Jacob, but in Hebrew it's the Hebrew letter Yod. But it's not just those letters that begin, it's the form of the letters called an Amorite imperfective. They're super abundant in the early second millennium, right? So long before Moses' time. They're super abundant in ancient Near Eastern literature, so in Akkadian texts, so Semitic languages. They're very abundant, and not only are they very abundant in general, they're very abundant in word names that begin with I and J in English. They become increasingly less as time goes on, but also the percentages of IJ names that are that form are also increasingly less, right? So one of the things I do with my students is I go through the Social Security Administration with the United States. What are the most common names right now? What were they 100 years ago? And while a lot of the most common names are similar, the ones that are now most common weren't even in the top 100 100 years ago. Like, Bertha, Mabel, which was my grandmother's name, things like that. These are the kind of things that you probably, if you didn't study them, you wouldn't have invented. But we don't have a discipline of history of that sort of stuff, and really until the modern period. So even if they got those things screamingly wrong, nobody would really know until we have these modern historical studies of all of this ancient literature. It wouldn't have mattered. And yet, the price of slaves, depending on the time period, the region of the world, they get these little details screamingly right again and again, where it really doesn't matter. Like, if they didn't get it right, who would know? If they're just writing good fiction, like, who would care until now? You know what I'm saying? When we're like looking at these things. And so I always find that it's the boring stuff. It's not did the Red Sea part or not. These are the boring things, the side details that they get screamingly right. It's like watching a movie and they get the hot dog price right. They get, the things that nobody's really paying attention to. I find really interesting. So for me, the important thing is it seems to indicate that they fit really well in the time period that they purport to be taking place and in the region that they are. So I think that that they tend to be, I would say, trustworthy of the sorts of cultural customs that we don't have to read them as, well, these are, fictional novellas from 1,000 years later that have no touchstone in reality, that actually they seem to indicate that they are talking about real people, real places, even if we don't know of those figures from outside of the text. That's what I would say. Kind of a long-winded response.
No, it's very interesting response. And thank you. Thank you very much.
And it's controversial too. But,
Well, that makes it even more interesting.
but I actually think what you said about the trends in English literature, I wouldn't be surprised if there's an influence here, because Jacques Derrida would be one of the figures, big figures with deconstruction, probably influenced by Foucault, probably influenced by Nietzsche, who was definitely influenced by Wellhausen.
Well, this is the thing that I found very interesting, because Jacques Derrida is one of the figures that I was thinking of, and he taught at Yale, and my husband actually went to his lecture or class or something.
Wow.
And Paul de Man, if you might have heard of, these
Sure.
folks were very, very influential in English literature, but they were not just in English literature. They were about questioning text, questioning even truth. And there's a really wonderful book called The Fall of Paul de Man by David Lehman. And it's about the sort of pervasiveness of this kind of way of analyzing literature that was also influential in the culture. And it came out that Paul de Man was actually sympathetic to the Nazis, and he had written things that were, when he was in, I think, France and the Nazis took over, he had written things that were sympathetic to them, but some of these deconstructionists were advocating for him, saying, oh, well, he didn't really mean what he was saying, you know, he was subverting whatever. But it was very convenient for him in terms of survival, and it was evil, you know. And I mean, the questioning of actual good and evil, it was part of this whole process. So I mean, I do wonder sometimes about the connections with biblical criticism and other fields as well.
It wouldn't surprise me if Nietzsche is a key figure there.
Yeah.
Alistair McIntyre links him with the genealogical tradition that kind of plays its way out that way. I mean, I
Yeah.
think there's that, and then the Frankfurt School, which of course would be kind of the opposite, because Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, of course, were leaving Nazi Germany as Jews, as neo-Marxists, but as Jews in England and then eventually in the United States during that time. And their book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, is really, I think, interesting because it gets into some of these same issues. But yeah, that's critical theory. That's where critical theory comes from.
Yeah. Very interesting. Any other questions? Maribel looks like she has one.
Yes, yeah, no, I don't. I have one silly question, but I was just letting everybody else go first. Any other questions?
Well, I just sort of have a thought which Nancy brought up, and it's too bad Marta is not here with us, because I can just see them bringing some of this digital humanities, text mining, comparing periods, all this digital stuff, which is not my field. I mean, I'm not proficient at it, but I'm sure there are people out there who would be having a field day with all these controversies and trying to do that. Yes.
Yeah. There have been studies on that. In fact, Bergsma, my co-author, is one of the guys working on this. And what he's discovered is when you start to see, this is how he discovered that Ezekiel almost certainly knows Deuteronomy and Leviticus, because these rare forms of verbs from this, he's talking about the wilderness period that they're talking about. And he's using all sorts of verbs, and there's like plays on the text that are coming right from the text. The really interesting thing, I think, is with the issue of where do these documents come from, is the split between biblical studies and ancient Near Eastern studies. So as we uncovered this history of the development of these theories, it starts to move with Homeric scholarship. So what you start to have is the Homeric corpus of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Pentateuch are being kind of divided at the same time into hypothetical sources that we don't know for sure ever existed, based on stylistic variation and differences in the texts themselves. So they're noticing that different vocabulary is being used in different parts of Homer, and different vocabulary for the same things is being used in the Pentateuch. And of course, these scholars they're together in the same departments, having lunch together, and they're basically working together on these common projects. And what starts to happen is they separate, and ancient Near Eastern studies separates as it gets going. And so by the 20th century, ancient Near Eastern scholars are doing their own thing, reading documents, and biblical scholars are relying upon these literary theories that developed in conjunction with Homeric scholarship, and they're running with them, even though now, for the first time, we have a treasure trove of ancient creation stories, flood stories, all sorts of literature coming from Mesopotamia, from Babylon, that we never had access to, where you have, oh, look, you have a flood account. Oh, you have a creation account. We've got a Sumerian epic of Enki and Nimrod, the Atrahasis epic, Enuma Elish. And the biblical scholars aren't dealing with any of that. They are imposing these hypothetical literary theories on the text without doing that with the ancient Near Eastern corpus. And so there's a wonderful book that just came out doing this, trying to do this with the flood narratives in the ancient Near East. And what they showed is it doesn't work very well. And the reason is because ancient Near Eastern ancient Near Eastern authors typically used more than one name for God. They typically wrote a prose and a poetic account of the same event. In fact, there's a wonderful book right here that I reviewed a few years back, Inconsistency in the Torah by Joshua Berman, Ancient Literary Convention and the Limits of Source Criticism. We use this at the end of our book. And what he does is he goes through serious, Egyptian texts, Babylonian texts, and others, which he can read in the original language. And he shows that these patterns are standard. That the king would put an inscription. It had a prose account, a poetic account. It had multiple accounts of the same thing, but it's the same author, right? And so what they show is these studies have indicated that what used to be seen as a telltale sign of multiple authorship, that's the kind of the basis of this, Elohim here, Yahweh there, is standard practice in ancient Near Eastern texts. And so when you actually compare them with other texts, this is somewhat normal. So it becomes it is pretty interesting. But in digital scholarship is actually driven that. That's what's actually driven a lot of these studies.
I'm just going to apologize that I need to slip out, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here.
Bye, Monsignor.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Anybody else?
You didn't ask yours, Maribel.
Yeah, it's a silly one. I'm just right now just a silly one. The name of the book.
Ah, that was John.
Okay, talk to us.
Well, he wanted to, so we were debating what to call this, and we came up with all sorts of different ones. Of course, I'm not good with titles or names, and somehow, at least the main title, he came up with this because the murmuring is in the wilderness. This is one of the big criticisms of the people. Is the infidelity is referenced by that they're murmuring against God, and they're murmuring against Moses. Actually, in the New Testament, this becomes important as well. So, for example, the Gospel of John, chapter 6, in the Bread of Life discourse, it's the same sort of context. They're talking about the manna, the wilderness. They're in the wilderness. They're talking about the bread that God's going to give them. And it says that they were murmuring against him. So this murmuring theme is really important. It's in the prophets. And so we thought this would be kind of a nice play on texts. We're talking about the Pentateuch, where the people are murmuring against Moses, and kind of the history of scholarship, where in a sense, that's a lot of what's going on, is murmuring against Moses or the Mosaic tradition.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, that was John's. That was his one of his contributions.
I love it. I love Dr. Bersma. That was one of the authors that you introduced us to, and I use him as extra readings for my students, and it's because he's so smart. He's such a smart biblical scholar. But when he writes, he could write at the level that you're saying, what is he saying? But he could write also at the level of our students to understand what he's talking about. I love him.
He's amazing. So this book is not like that, in that he's the top scholar in the world for the Jubilee tradition and its history of reception. And when you read that or this, these are a little bit, this is not the kind of thing you would give to first-year students. But he also writes a book called Bible Basics for Catholics.
I use it.
Stick figures.
I use it.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the one. That's the one I use. Especially when we especially in Dr. Ratwan will call the police on me, the copyright police, because you used to do it, so don't even go there.
Maribel, be quiet. I'm the copyright librarian. I'm closing my ears.
Yes, that's right. But this is my extra reading for the students, and you give them these readings that they had never. I mean, I'm not talking about seminarians, obviously, but about the other students. You give them the readings, and then you give them Bergsma, and it's like, whoa, professor. Is like he opened my eyes with the stick figures. I mean,
he's clear.
He is very clear. He's very clear.
Yeah, he's got numbers. He's got a series: New Testament Basics for Catholics, Psalms Basics for Catholics. He's amazing because he can take really complicated material, and I mean, I use some of his stuff when I teach this stuff to my children. He's so great. I mean, the stick figures is so helpful. Then you can reproduce it. Yeah.
I love those.
He's amazing. He's amazing. Yeah, I think he's one of Franciscan University of Steubenville's best kept secrets because he's not as famous as some of the other names, but he's really a jewel. I mean, he's really an incredible teacher, an incredible scholar. And he was great to work with. He's amazing.
It's him and Petrie. You introduce
Yes.
us to them.
Well,
It's
they
him.
just came out with a book. They came out with, I have it somewhere, a Catholic Introduction to the Bible, the Old Testament. They just co-authored it. Yeah, it's
I
yeah,
do,
Brant Petrie.
have it, but they're scholars that they could be out there with the top scholars in the world, but they could also come down to the students at the same
Yeah.
level of them.
No, they are. I mean, I've witnessed both of them at major scholarly international communities of scholars. And, I remember Brant, there, he's going up, with a senior scholar. Brant, these guys are a few years older than I am. And I'm, mid 40s, 44. I think Brant might be, I don't remember. John's about 50. I think Brant is a little, maybe 49, but we're all similar ages. And I've seen them as senior guys in their field, and they're talking about the Testament of Levi in Aramaic in their head. They know, they're talking about these little changes, but, they know the material so well. It's really impressive. But they can also speak to audiences of every age level and really communicate. They're very good. They are exceptional.
Yeah, if you are not familiar with them, I really suggest that you, they have YouTube videos where they talk about all this, their scholarship, and they're really, really good. It's Petrie and Bergsma. They're really, and of course, let's just talk about Scott Hahn, Nancy. We could put stuff together, but the time that they brought him into school, they had to change the venue because there was a lot of people who
You talking about
signed
Scott?
up to, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
in
know if
history,
you were here or no. Were you
I
here?
was. Yeah, we're working on a book right now. We're working on two right now, but on my sabbatical, he has this bird's eye view that is I've never encountered anywhere. I just give one anecdote. We got a minute. I've never seen anybody do this. I mean, I've never seen people talk about it as like a pseudo scholar or whatever. I've never seen anybody do this, but every conference we're at, doctoral students will come up. We've all had doctorate. I mean, we know what this is like. They'll come up. They just finished their PhD. They want to talk to him because they like his work. And they said, "Oh, did you just write on the Sumerian Gudea cylinders?" And of course, Scott, he doesn't read Sumerian. And the guy said, "I did under so-and-so." He's like, "I just read your dissertation." He's like, "How could I just graduated? It's University of Michigan, just public. Like, how could you? Nobody read my dissertation. How could you?" He's like, "I did. What you did in the third chapter was amazing. It's worth. You should publish it just because of that." And then he starts to talk to them about their third chapter. I've been with him when he does this, and the students, their jaws drop. He said, "This guy just read my dissertation." And I was with him. I'll share this because Father Jerry Bracken. Guys, maybe you remember
Yes,
Father Jerry
yes,
Bracken. So
Father
Father
Bracken.
Pablo, when Scott came to give that lecture, this is fine to share. So Father Pablo Gadenz and I were with him in his room talking late at night at the seminary, and he said, "Father Pablo, is there a place we could eat?" So Father Pablo brought us to it was like midnight. He brought us to the priest dining room and got a sandwich together. And Father Jerry walks in, and introduces him, and and Scott says, "Are you the Father Jerry Bracken who did this dissertation on Aquinas and suffering?" And he said, "Yes." It was from decades before. He said, "Yes." He's like, "I loved it. I have it on my desk." And of course, Father Jerry's like, whatever, nice guy, whatever. He's like, "I recommended my son did this in his doctorate. I don't know if I agree with you, but what you did in this chapter, and he goes through and he's describing, he probably knew it better. I mean, it was amazing." And Father Jerry, you could see his face light up. I mean, I've never met he reads so much and he retains it. I've just never encountered that with any other scholar I've ever met in my life, but I've seen him do that many, many, many times. It's amazing.
That would be a great panel between some of our faculty members in the School of Theology and Scott and Nancy. You're muted.
Something, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Something to discuss, and maybe since you're working on books with him, Jeff, maybe you'll be our connecting person.
Yeah.
Really, we can talk about, having some kind
Sure.
of panel like that would be wonderful. Well, this has been a really, really interesting, wonderful discussion, Jeff. Thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you.
And we record these, and we're going to put this on the core website. And if you want to link to it or anything, I think you know, I know with my students, I'm making it an extra credit. They can watch it in their own time. Some of them, you know, obviously they can't always come at the time of the talk, but it's real. We really appreciate your taking the time on your sabbatical. So you're working on 2 books, you're saying right now?
Working on 3, but the 2 is Scott. One is a popular one that I'm in the midst of right now, dealing with the book of Joshua. But then we're doing one. So we wrote a few years ago, we did one on modern biblical criticism as a tool of statecraft, 1700 to 1900. So we focus on the history of scholarship from 1700 to 1900 and the kind of the political aspect of what was going on in that time. So this is a sequel to that, more in my area on the modernist controversy with Alfred Loisy, who I've written a bit on. And we're doing that. That's going to take that one might not get done. I mean, my sabbatical is almost over, so that one might not get completely written by the end of the sabbatical, but it'll get done eventually.
Well, we appreciate your taking the time. I know what it is. I've had 2 sabbaticals in my time here, and I've never gotten everything done I wanted to get done. You get something, you get a lot more done than you could do otherwise, but
That's right.
It's you know, it's tough. But thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming. And our next Scholars Forum is going to be Dermot Quinn. He has agreed to do his presentation on the book about the history of Seton Hall, and I think we're all excited about that. But I think that's going to be May 3rd. We will confirm it definitely, but he has agreed to do it. The history department's doing some kind of event for him, and so we wanted to do it after that. We don't want to steal their thunder. But Jeff, when you get these 2 books published, we'll just have to have you back. And I don't know about what Maria's doing, but she did a presentation for us as well. So if she's got anything, please let us know. I enjoy these so much, these discussions, and this was just such a pleasure to listen to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I wish
Thank you,
everybody
Dr. Morrow.
a blessed Holy Week and a happy Easter, and thank you again. Okay. Bye-bye.